We're on. We are live. Find your place. So you heard the cowbells back there. For those of you not familiar, when Tiffany moved her worship service, heartstring service, into the theater, the one thing that we were missing were the horns honking at the end of every song. So we replaced the horn honking with cowbells. So if you really get excited about what Tom says, you can go up and get a cowbell and ring it. I found a party-sized bag of miniature Snickers. I don't know if it belongs to First Company or to Heartstrings, but it belongs to us now. So I'm going to pass it around. They left it out, so we're going to eat them. Get you a little party-sized Snicker. So, well, yeah, started at the wrong place. Tom's going to talk a little bit about the future of the United Methodist Church and answer questions you might have, and he's going to gaze into that crystal ball and tell us where we're going. So, Tom, thank you for being here again.
There we go. I wanted to get the mic turned on. Thank you all. Thanks for everybody who's come. I know we've got some clergy here, some lay people that are here, and really so pleased that you've come. Those of you who are joining online, I am sorry. Kent is going to send by Amazon a chocolate bar to your address, and that's sorry you're not in on that. I'm Tom Berlin. I'm a pastor in Herndon, Virginia, which is near Dulles Airport, outside the nation's capital. I've been a General Conference delegate several times. I lead our delegation in Virginia. I was a part of something called the Commission on the Way Forward, which was trying to create a way for the United Methodist Church to have as much unity as possible, but also to think about how we might change policies that were in the Book of Discipline related to LGBTQ persons and related to marriage and ordination. That led to the 2019 General Conference. That was not a good experience for me because the plan I worked very hard on, which was called the One Church Plan, which would enable different people to do different things. It gave a wide capacity for people to honor their own conscience and still be one church. And because of some very effective work that groups that are now aligned to what's called the Global Methodist Church, they're talking about starting their own denomination. They did very effective organizing of the Central Conference's votes. The Central Conference is everything beyond the United States. Think Africa, Europe, and the Philippines, where about, well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I'm not going to say, but where a lot of United Methodists live, and that's where a lot of our growth is in those areas. And so they did very effective organizing, and they, rather than choosing that plan in 2019, they chose what is called the traditional plan, which I can talk about. And then, as soon as the General Conference is over, said, now we want to leave, which felt odd to many of us because they won. They won every vote. They won it by the most narrow margin they had ever won by, but then they said, we want to leave. And you've probably heard about some of that organizing. What I want to do today, because I was trying to think, how do you structure this, because I wasn't sure what questions you all would have. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about, will General Conference be held? I'll give you that first. I can give you I can give you what I know. And then I can give you, I can also talk about a really interesting experience that I know Kent was at and I was at Church of the Resurrection back in October, where they gathered about 700 of us who serve United Methodist churches across the country to say, what might the United Methodist Church look like in the future? I can tell you about that experience and combine that with some other conversations that I've been a part of. Another thing that I was a part of after the 2019 General Conference was something called the Protocol of Reconciliation through Separation. Now, we don't usually put reconciliation and separation in the same sentence. But what that group did is it was a mediated agreement between members of the coalition that is now calling itself the Global Methodist Church and those of us who want to stay as United Methodist. And it was a brokered agreement that Kenneth Feinberg, Mr. Feinberg, did the 9/11 fund. He is any major mediated agreement that's happened in the United States in the past 15 years, Ken Feinberg's always at the center of it. He gave his time to the United Methodist Church to help us develop a protocol for separation that would be a mediated agreement that we could take to General Conference. And of course, we finished that work in January of 2020. You may remember in March of 2020, we had something happen that postponed the General Conference. It was COVID, of course. And so that mediated agreement, which probably could have passed, I think, that's my prediction, at that time, I think is now very much in question because 2 years has passed. And there's a lot of water under the bridge, and there are a lot of things that have happened that have been not experienced in positive ways by many who want to remain in the United Methodist Church from that GMC coalition. So I can talk about some of that if you're interested. That's who I am in brief. More importantly, I'm married. My wife's name is Karen. I have 4 daughters, and that's the better part of my life. So if we can go to the next slide. So I've already said a little bit about this. What's all this about? Why is this General Conference such a big deal? And it's a big deal because we have more strict language in our Book of Discipline about LGBTQ plus exclusion. The Book of Discipline is now written to exclude people. That's what the traditional plan does. You can like that or you can dislike that, but it simply must be observed that that's what it is. And it's caused deepening divisions in our United Methodist denomination we've been dealing with this since the 1970s. I have another handy presentation if you want to walk through that details this history since the 1970s that I put together for another group recently that asked me they said, help us understand why this is so hard for people. And until I put together that presentation, I didn't really get it. I didn't really understand why it's been so hard, but it's just been debated for so long. Next slide, please. The traditional plan was passed, and these are the basic elements of that traditional plan. In case you're wondering, well, why are people so frustrated? Some people. Well, first it says no marriage and no ordination of LGBTQ persons. That's been in the Book of Discipline for years, so that's not different. What is different is that if a clergy person violates that by performing a same-gender marriage, they will be suspended immediately. There is very little due process in this. If the bishop knows you've done it, you're going to be suspended. Second, if you have a second violation, you have to surrender your credentials. And so basically what this policy says is we're not fooling around with anybody who breaks the rule. And there is no longer a, quote, just resolution process. Our bishops used to have the capacity to negotiate it and say, well, if you did this in your annual conference here out west, maybe you'd have a more generous outcome than I would in Virginia. We're a part of the Southeast jurisdiction. It's a very different culture than the Western jurisdiction in some ways, especially around these issues. And so that just resolution process was what really frustrated more traditional United Methodists. And I'm going to try not to use the word traditional anymore. I'm going to try to use the word incompatibilist. So I'm going to use 2 words. Some United Methodists believe, well, wait a minute, I think I've got a slide on this. Go to the next slide. Oh, there it is. Wow, I'm on track. Okay, good. I really should have printed it. Some United Methodists believe that I cannot be in a church where others disagree with me and are allowed to do something different than I believe regarding same-sex marriage. And if anybody does it anywhere, I'm out. That sentence is almost verbatim what I've had a leader of the Good News Movement say to me. Again, I'm not for it, I'm not against it. I need to observe that that's a statement that was given to me by somebody who writes for Good News all the time. Then there are compatibilists. Compatibilists are, I can be in a church where others disagree with me and are allowed to do something different than I believe regarding same-sex marriage, I would add, or ordination. Which is to say that in some annual conferences, there might be more ordinations of LGBTQ persons. There might be some annual conferences where there won't be any. But can we create a space where there could be a variance of practice in different regions and different localities to allow people to honor conscience in those spaces, observing that our country as a whole is changing around how we see LGBTQ persons. Let me give you a little example of that. I grew up in Winchester, Virginia, which is a mid-sized town in Virginia. It is fair to say that the average person in the town I grew up in when I was a child, if they found out that you were gay, if they were polite, they wouldn't talk about it. It would just be like we don't go there would be the way we would deal with that. There would be no church in town that would have performed a marriage in the town I grew up in at the time I grew up in it. Now, I grew up in that town in the 70s and the 80s, or well, 60s and 70s and a little bit of the 80s. And this is how we make ourselves younger than we are. And And so that's where the town was. I don't remember anyone being persecuted. I do remember a lot of terrible jokes about being gay. I remember a lot of language that was exceedingly negative, and church people would say it, but never in church. Does that make sense? So, my father is 85 years old now. He and I go, there's an estate called Glen Burnie. It's a big estate home, a lot of land, and the man who lived there owned Glen Burnie for all the years I grew up. Very wealthy family. The family goes back to the founding of our town. His name was Mr. Glass. Mr. Glass, when he died, donated his entire estate to the city of Winchester. And now you can go walk through, and he had so many beautiful antiques. They built a museum next door with the estate money that is now open. You can tour that and see all the things, and they've got it as the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. It's beautiful. We're walking through Glen Burnie, and the interpretation of the house has pictures of Mr. Glass and his partner. Because, see, Mr. Glass was gay. And I turned to my dad and I'm like, hey, Dad, I'm in Winchester, Virginia, and Mr. Glass and his partner are both in the pictures and they're holding hands on a beach. How is that for you to see that? And he goes, oh, Tom, who cares? We all knew they were gay. He said there wasn't any big secret. He said it's just that we all knew not to talk about it. And I said, so how do you feel about that? Now, we've had this conversation because of my work in the Methodist Church. And he said, this was a person who left his entire estate to our city. And for us not to tell the truth about who he was and how he lived, that would be shame on us. What I'm observing is America is changing. And we haven't changed, but we are changing. And that dimension is reflected in your church. Currently, we tend to have two groups. Some people who say, if anybody gets married who's gay anywhere in a same-gender marriage in the entire system, I'm out. Even though they won the vote, they want to get out, which, I just find fascinating. And then there's a whole bunch of us, and I've got a real dear friend of mine, and he has a more traditional view on this, but he's a compatibilist. And we've had a lot of conversations about this. And recently, in a conversation several months ago, he looked at me and he goes, you seriously want people like me in the church, don't you? And I said, how many times do we have to do this before you get that? I said, of course I want you in the church. I said, I don't need you to perform a same-gender marriage, but can't we agree to live in the unity of love in the church? And he said, well, yeah. And I said, well, I said, all this work I've been doing, that's what it's been for. I think we can have the both and. That's a compatibilist view. Next slide, please. So when people were leaving the 2019 General Conference, my experience as a delegate was, and I had been in a fairly public space in that. So I'm walking out of the convention center and I'm dragging my luggage, whatever it was, my little briefcase behind me. And I'm dragging a lot more than that. And people I know who won the vote and won the traditional plan kept walking up to me saying, and when I saw them, they were people I knew, I said, hey, I'm not for it, but congratulations. You all worked really hard. You won all the votes. I said, our margin was better than it's ever been, but you still won every time. And every single one of them, as I'm walking back to my hotel, which was about 5-10 blocks away, said, it doesn't feel much like a win. Now, I found that hard to take. And I said, you know what? I don't know about you, but when I win every vote, I just go back to the hotel and say, well done. We wanted to win, we organized to win, and we won. And I said, I find it a little disingenuous for you to look at me and say it doesn't feel like a win, because you crushed a lot of souls to do this. And you guys were hard. And these were all men I was speaking to, so I could say you guys were all tough. And it doesn't feel like much of a win. What I realized they meant in a conversation the next morning is they were saying to me, you're never going to give up. Like, we're going to always have this in front of us, aren't we? And when they said it that way, I said, oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. And that's not a threat. That's not because I like conflict. That's because many of us who are compatibilists have a conviction. And it's the conviction of values that's driving the conversation, just as people that are incompatibilist, what drives that is a conviction of values. And we have this happening in this. So this group has now decided it would rather leave. And you can read about this, and it's called the Global Methodist Church, and there's the Good News Movement and the Confessing Movement, and a number of movements and groups, and they're all aligned. So we're supposed to have this 2020 General Conference. That's where the protocol was going to be so helpful. In 2020, we might have just been able to resolve it, cut our losses, move on. But it was delayed, and currently it's scheduled to be in August and September of 2022. Next slide, please. So there's this commission on the General Conference, and they decide if we're going to have it or not. And we're all, every month just about, we're all screaming at them saying, what have you decided? And every month they say, well, we haven't decided yet. Well, a few months ago, they put out this list. And they said, here's the criteria upon which we will make the decision. We want a reasonable threshold for delegate participation, both overall and globally. So here's the deal. We could have this General Conference tomorrow and only have U.S. delegates and have enough delegates to have a quorum. They can do that. But if they do that, they leave out 40% of our denomination, right? They leave out all the people in Africa, all the people in the Philippines, all the people in Europe. So then they say we want a global representation, and there are three things you've got to have. You've got to have vaccinations, because unless you're vaccinated, you're not going to get the second thing, which is the U.S. visa. You've got to get a visa to come in country. And the third thing you've got to have is a negative COVID test 24 hours before you get on the airplane. So there are now three things that every delegate has to have to come in August. I don't think that COVID test is going to go away by August. That's my guess, especially people from other countries, because our country doesn't want to bring in more COVID from another country, just the same way other countries don't want us to bring it into theirs. And we've been more of a problem for other people than they have been for us. There's the health and safety of General Conference delegates. So if there's another COVID surge, they said, we're not going to hold it because we don't want to do that to anybody. Third, inclusion, anti-racism, integrity, credibility, the recognition of our mission to make disciples. Frankly, after you get past the top four, I think it all says normal things about the Methodist Church. So that's what they say their criteria is. They meet this week on Thursday. Many of us are hopeful that they will actually make a decision. But what they've told us is we will make a decision in the first quarter of 2022, which means they could put this decision off for one more month. How on earth you do a meeting of this size that's a global meeting where you've got to have airline reservations and all that and only give yourself 6 months to plan it? I'm glad that's not my job. So I think they'd be wise to go ahead and make a decision Thursday, but I don't know that they will. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I can tell you a whole lot about this conference and sort of where I envision those of us who remain in the United Methodist Church headed. I just want to tell you, I don't have a crystal ball. You're hearing Tom Berlin's best guess. But I attend a lot of meetings and I talk to a lot of people. So I think I've got a sense of the whole, but my sense is disproportionately affected by people who serve in large congregations, even though I've got lots and lots of input from people who are in smaller congregations. But the formal settings I attend tend to be with larger congregations. So that is both my bias and my data set. And I just want to say that up front so you know that. But let me stop here because I want to see what your questions are so that I get into the right flow of information. Yes. The compatibilist. So the question, for those of you online, the question is, hey, you're in Virginia and you're in the Southeast jurisdiction. What's the presence, how many compatibilists do you all have, right? So one way to look at that is to say, if the protocol was passed, whole annual conferences could leave. We have some estimates that up to 5 might leave. Now, every church in those annual conferences would not leave. So I'm not going to list all the ones that might leave because this is taped and then I'm on tape and then I got to deal with that. So I'm not dealing with that. But we could imagine an annual conference south of Atlanta somewhere that might be a likely candidate based on what they have said. Not based on what I think, but based on what many of those leaders have said. I serve on the Southeast Jurisdiction Committee on Episcopacy. This is a question we are actively considering because we have to think about how many bishops we elect. We don't want to elect too many because they're real expensive. And so, and that's not because they make the biggest salaries in our connection, by the way. That's because there's travel and everything else. Your question is, there's some people think we could lose 4 or 5 annual conferences, but if that conference left that was south of Atlanta, it would probably take the majority of its churches, but we can imagine a number of its churches would say, no, we want to stay. We're compatibilist. Then what we would need to do is redraw the conference lines in a way to include that geographical region. So that's what's going to happen in all these circumstances, whether churches leave or annual conferences leave. Now, currently, the way the Book of Discipline is written, an annual conference cannot leave. I think what we're going to see in the coming 3 months when annual conferences in the U.S. begin to meet is I think some annual conferences will attempt to leave to test the Book of Discipline. Because that's what I would do. I would do a test case. So I think we'll see some test cases created. I know of some conferences where that's a discussion. And personally, I don't think the Judicial Council is going to allow it. But to your question, when we get in the Southeast jurisdiction and we go, a lot of this is about the Bible Belt. It's where you see the largest presence of self-identified evangelical Christians who are also United Methodist. So Virginia has a smaller population. There's no chance our annual conference would leave. We have some churches that will leave. I just polled our delegation last week. The numbers range between 5 and about 20%. That's the estimate. I'm on the 5% end of that. In our conference, we will lose smaller churches in rural areas. But remember, we have Lynchburg, Virginia, right? The culture of Lynchburg, Virginia is it's very influenced by Jerry Falwell and his son and Liberty University. So we can't be surprised that they're going to be incompatibilist in Lynchburg, Virginia, as there will be in other parts of our state. But the majority in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, Florida, there are just a lot of places where I'm not concerned about a conference leaving. But I think the Southeast and the South Central jurisdictions will have the largest number of churches and conferences that will leave our connection. That's my sense, but all I'm describing is where the Bible Belt is traditionally described. So, any other questions? Yes. So the question is, based on reading in the United Methodist News Service, I'm speaking to the folks online, that the question is, I think there's already a lot of churches that have identified, and in one conference it's identified. I don't know about the one conference. Yeah, that's fine. We don't need that. But here's my thing. There have been churches. So there are currently 2 paragraphs in the Book of Discipline that allow churches to leave the denomination. And almost all bishops in our connection right now, in our U.S. connection, are wide open to helping churches make that step. So there's this narrative on this side that says the bishops are going to work against you, the bishops are going to charge you all this money, the bishops are bad, the bishops. You would think that these people have horns on their heads. Every bishop I know, and I know all of them in the Southeast jurisdiction, and I attended a meeting recently where they said, we're absolutely working with churches to do that. In Virginia, that's about 12. But what you need to remember are the larger numbers. Do you know how many in our whole connection in the U.S., how many churches? In Virginia, we have over 1,000 churches. We have 12 that are currently trying to leave. Now, when you hear that, what registers higher in your brain? 12 trying to leave or 1,000 staying? So when you read the news report, think about the volume of churches in the entire country. And I would bet that in your region, you might be biased toward the number of people leaving because you have how many, in your annual conference, how many churches do you have? 300? You have about 300 churches in your conference. Your jurisdiction has about as many churches as my annual conference. So don't look at the total number of churches, but let us also observe that I'd rather not lose any churches. But we're also in a time of high self-definition. That's just true in every part of our country. Every conversation you're in, it's healthy for people to say, if I stay here, I'm going to be nothing but conflict. I need to go do my thing. That's not a sign that you're a bad person. That's a sign that you're dealing with an observation about the conflict level you're experiencing. So I think that more churches will stay than depart. That's what I think. Do you have anybody online? It's not. Do you have the handheld that Kent was using? There we go.
Test. Okay.
Todd, so those of you online, Todd is monitoring the chat, and he's going to speak into what you write in the chat stream. Go ahead.
So Bryson asks, can you say more about why the protocol passing is now in question? In other words, if we actually got to have a conference, why is there a larger question? Say more about that, that it would pass.
I am describing a personal concern. And I'd be interested, Kent, you're a delegate, I'm curious if you're having the same experience, and I'm not predicting anything. So, you know, one of the sad things is sometimes if you're a person who talks about this, people take what you say and they burn you with it. And that really leads us to either never have conversation. So God bless you if you're watching this later and you're going to get Tom Berlin, go for it. But here's my point. Many annual conferences have endorsed the protocol. They did that 2 years ago. But now when I talk to delegates are starting to say, well, I like the protocol, but I want to amend it. They shouldn't get $25 million. Annual conferences shouldn't be able to leave. This shouldn't be able to happen, that shouldn't happen. Mediated agreements only work because when you walk out of the room, everybody feels like they lost. I'm quoting Ken Feinberg, who's the grand master of all mediated agreements in America in recent years. When I left the protocol meetings, I didn't walk out and celebrate and think, wow, our team won. I walked out saying, wow, I had to give up a lot to get to that mediation. I don't know if he's telling the truth or not, but Keith Boyette, someone I know, somebody I have appreciated over the years for his ministry and his work. He's from Virginia, so I've known him for a long time. Keith Boyette said, I feel like I had to give up a lot, you know? So in a mediated agreement, you can't, if you amend it, you no longer have a mediated agreement. So the question that to the person online, I need to look up here, to the person online, what I would say to you is, if delegates choose to amend it, the coalition around it will fall apart instantly. That's just the nature of a mediated agreement. But it has been 2 years, and there's been some ill will that's been generated by what's been said about the United Methodist Church, and people are not in a very generous spirit right now. That's my observation. And so when delegates say to me from different parts of the country, and we also have many people in the continent of Africa who are United Methodists who have said, I'll never vote for that. And Bishop John Yambasu from Sierra Leone was the bishop who helped create the entire protocol process. He was killed in a car accident a year and a half ago. He no longer has the ability to go around Africa and build the coalition in that context. And there's nobody else who's doing that work to my knowledge. So my point is, I'm not predicting the death of the protocol. I'm observing we're in a different space than we were 2 years ago. And listen, there are amendments I'd love to make to the protocol. I tried to make them before the protocol was the protocol. But a mediated agreement didn't like that. So let me say one last thing, and then I'm going to take your question. One of the aspects of the protocol was an abeyance. It asked every bishop in the U.S., if someone did a same-gender marriage, rather than bringing them up on charges, just put it in abeyance. Put it on a section of your desk where things just sit. You've got a part of your desk like that, right? It's a file folder, right, where you put important things that you don't want to deal with, right? So the abeyance, the idea was take those charges and just stick them in that file folder. Let us resolve this in a couple months at General Conference. So the abeyance was designed for like 6 months. It's 2 years later. I'm in an annual conference where the bishop has chosen not to honor the abeyance. She's very vocal about that. I don't like it, but she's not doing it undercover. We have 2 clergy under charges right now. Well, That's a broken piece of the protocol for me. So when people come to me and they say, I want to amend it, I'm like, yeah, I'd like to amend it some too, because I didn't get out of the protocol the thing I asked to put in it. And so we're all having that experience, and it's because the pandemic has delayed the thing. This protocol was designed for 6 months. We need to resolve this, and we need to do it in a civil manner and in a positive manner and in a thoughtful manner. I'm just observing what the circumstances are. In the back, and then if you've got another one, Todd, let me know. So churches don't choose delegates. Conferences choose delegates. So when your annual conference session is held, every 4 years, delegates are chosen to go to the next general conference. That's done about a year, 2 years ahead of time in many places, sometimes 1 year ahead of time. Is your all's practice one year ahead of time? That's how we are. So what happened this year is the 2019 general conference and the traditional plan happened. And then, that was in what month? February. And then in June, annual conferences, May and June, annual conferences were held. And between the traditional plan being passed and when those elections were held, a whole bunch of people got organized. And we have more progressive, let me just say it differently, we have more compatibilists who are open to LGBTQ inclusion than we have ever had in the United States of America going to a general conference. And it's one of the reasons I think that this group feels motivated to say, let's negotiate it, let's figure it out, and let's get it done. Because if that keeps happening, which I think it will, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to maintain the traditional plan. So that's what happened the last time. I can't make any prediction of what will happen in the next time. I do think it's wise for us to resolve this. I find that in a family, if you have an unresolved conflict that separates people, the very best thing the family can do is resolve it. Right? That may be, we all go to counseling together and we figure it out. That may be, we've got to have a divorce. But unresolved stuff produces its own trauma that's just not helpful to anybody. So, let's go. Do you have any more? Okay, here. Yeah. The question is, have this GMC, the Global Methodist Church Coalition, which is about 4 or 5 groups, are they narrowly focused on LGBTQ inclusion, or is it a more broad concern with the Methodist Church? And I would argue yes to both. The presenting issue is LGBTQ inclusion. But I think it could be observed that this group of people has been unhappy with the denomination for 30, what decade are we in? 30, 40 years. 40 years. Because some of these groups are that old. And they only formed because they were frustrated. Like if you, like I've always been pretty happy being United Methodist. I don't have a group. I never had a group. Until like last year, a group of us got together and said, well, I guess we need a group, you know? And and we're terrible at groups. We don't know how to run them. We don't have any time for them. I mean, it's just, we're awful at our groups. These people are incredibly organized. They have money, they have staff, they have budgets, and they have donors because, to your question, they've been broadly, they're frustrated by the role of bishops. They're frustrated that some regions of our country are more progressive and some are less. They want everybody to be the same. They want them not to be progressive, by the way, on any topic. One of the presenting issues in the 70s was abortion. Now the presenting issue is LGBTQ inclusion. My question is, what's your next issue? Like if you're going to be unhappy, you're going to find when this one gets resolved, if you have an orientation to critical work at another group and you no longer have that group, where do you get your energy now? Because I'll tell you, there is a lot of energy in this conflict for these folks. And again, I'm not criticizing, I'm observing. And you know what? If it's a big value issue, if your big value issue and your big conviction is no one should do a same-gender marriage anywhere in our church, if that's your big conviction, then absolutely our denomination is going to frustrate you. Because many of us want to live in a think and let think kind of space around an issue like that. Now, we're not think and let think about everything. We're Wesleyan, we're Christian, but, and can I just say that your jurisdiction, the Western jurisdiction, has been a punching bag for 40 straight years. Because the stereotype is this is where all the crazy liberal people live, and this is where all the people, and then I come out here and meet United Methodists, and I find that you're very much like the people I work with every day. You are not the stereotype that is created here. But I have some people that sometimes in my conference that I wish wouldn't talk as much. Do you have any of those people? We're like, if you would stop talking, we could live in love together and it'd be fine. But anyway, I can talk more about that in a little bit. Any other questions? Let's go here and then here. So the question is about the global church, the nature of where it's growing and where it's not growing, and how will that affect future dynamics? How will it affect dynamics here? How will it affect dynamics in the Methodist church that remains? So let me just make some broad answers to that. Christianity is shrinking in the global north. This is not Tom Berlin, this is the Pew Center. It's shrinking in the global north and it's expanding in the global south. Think Africa, think South America, Central America, those regions of the world. So how does that affect the United Methodist Church? Europe, its decline in Christianity, 2% of Europeans go to church anywhere, anytime. Think about that number, friends. We are now experiencing the decline that Europe went through 50 years ago. Their decline is absolutely connected to the end of World War II. And wouldn't it be interesting to study that? I don't know what ours is connected to, but I'll tell you this. Our worship attendance has never recovered from 9/11. We had the highest attendance of worship at 9/11, the Sundays thereafter, and then it's gone down. That's from Lovett Weems at the Lewis Leadership Center. So we're seeing this decline. Within that decline, the group that's doing the best right now are mainline churches. And that's in part because we are starting to be seen as the reasonable people in the room. Because the independent evangelical church has really suffered from poor leadership of highly visible megachurch pastors who have failed in a variety of ways. Not all of them, but some of them have done so dramatically. And we don't need to go on all that, but that's just true. Now, how does this affect our church? As the global south, as Methodist Church does well in places like Africa and places like the Philippines, isn't that great? Is that good news or bad news? That's good. No, friends, that's good news. That's nothing but good news. That's good news. We want people to know Christ. We want the mission work of the church to flourish. That's all great news. We want people to grow in their discipleship. But here's a tension. Those people will tend to be more very traditional in their thought life. And let's just take LGBTQ inclusion. In many countries in Africa, if not most, that's illegal. It's illegal to be gay. That can be a prison sentence. That can be a death penalty. Now think about being a United Methodist in that culture. How will that affect the global Methodist Church? I have no idea. I can't speak for it. I don't know how many of those people will leave. They would like to take the entire global church with them. That's why they called it the Global Methodist Church. They would love that. And they've got better partnerships. They've created an amazing voting bloc for years with these delegates. So maybe they can do that. I don't know. I do know because I've been very enmeshed in West Africa and Sierra Leone for the past 20 years. The cross and flame and the words the United Methodist Church mean everything in Africa. That is not a church you attend. That is an identity you hold. So if a group comes along and says, no, we're going to have a new logo and we're going to be Global Methodist, this group in Africa may look at that and say, no, we're not doing that. Now here's what's interesting. There is a group from the Philippines and Africa who have created a plan of regionalization. called the Christmas Covenant. That's what Central Conference delegates have been working on. And at the same time, the Connectional Table, which is the oversight board for the whole church, has created what is called the Regionalization Plan. And what it would do, if it was passed, is it would say, hey, why don't we have some variance in practice depending on where we are in the world? So if you're in a country where if someone is identified if a pastor would do a same-gender marriage, they might be put to death. Why don't we let you all just continue to be traditional and do what is right in your culture, you figure it out. Now again, as an American, I may look at that and agree or disagree, but I do respect other people's cultures. I feel no compunction to walk into an African culture and tell them what a smart guy from Virginia thinks, because they probably won't think I'm that smart. But what the regionalization plan would allow the U.S. to do is change its view on LGBTQ inclusion from the current Book of Discipline and do that in a way that compatibilists would stick and have space. And the question would be, what is going to be true for all of us and what's adaptable in the different locations? And so these two plans try to begin to identify that. That is absolutely necessary if the United Methodist Church is going to continue in the future, and here's why. Little trivia question. How much of the budget of our global church originates in the United States of America? What's the figure? Yes, sir. So one vote is 80%. Does anybody have another one? 95. Does anybody have another? 99.2, I think is the last I heard, or 98.8. I mean, it's higher than anything you just guessed. Now, what happens if we have a general conference that shows up and the people whose money supports the entire structure suddenly are in the minority vote? And thankfully, our delegates from the central conferences have put together it's called the Christmas Covenant. They've identified that and said, you know what, that doesn't feel good to us. Why don't we do this regionalization? Interestingly, those who are involved in the Global Methodist Church have said, if we go to a general conference, we're going to have to stay for the entire general conference, and we're not for that. And it's perfectly logical that they wouldn't be for it. They believe that whatever a Methodist does in one part of the world should be done in every part of the world. That's a part of being an incompatibilist. You love consistency and you love rules. Compatibilists tend to be more like, and listen, I've been doing work in Africa, and some of it was related to children, and we had to have some hard conversations about when we first started to work with children, there was a place called the Child Rescue Center. It was an institution. What type of punishment is allowed when a child breaks the rules? I got to tell you, when you sit for 2 hours and have that conversation with a group of African people from Sierra Leone and Americans who are their principal donors, and you talk about corporal punishment, that's a really interesting dialogue, because there's a cultural reflection of practice that has nothing to do with Christianity. The Bible actually says, spare the rod, spoil the child. But American Methodists looked at that and said, what I said is, look, if you want to lose all your donations, just let us know that you beat children. We won't give you any money. I'm not trying to hold you hostage. I'm telling you, I am all about donor transparency. And once we identify that children are being beaten with sticks, the donations all go away. I hear that that's a reflection of your culture. I'm also saying there's some real good social science to say that that used to be a part of our culture and we changed it, not because our culture eroded, but because our culture strengthened through learning things about social sciences. Friends, I've done that conversation, I'd like to know how many times over the past 20 years. Now we got rid of the institution, we moved everything to family-based care, and then families are figuring it out. The point is, I'm trying to give you that little example to tell you that when we talk about our global church, this is not the U.S. Congress that meets. This is the United Nations. Like, I wish it was the U.S. Congress, as dysfunctional as that is, and I live 30 minutes from the Capitol. So anyway, does that make sense? Yeah. So let's go here and then here. So Doug's question is, take the United Methodists who remain in a post-separation space. How do we need to restructure? What do we need to do? That is the million-dollar question. And in my opinion, a diverse group of United Methodists need to sit down and talk about that. When they sit down and discuss it, what they should observe is that church attendance in the United States of America was already declining, and the pandemic has accelerated that. Now, financially, we're fairly stable at this moment in our denomination. Our denominational giving is not taken a dramatic hit. In fact, they've been really surprised that our giving's been pretty steady in there. And more churches have fewer donors. So what we're finding in most local churches right now is that where donations are remaining level, it's because a few people are giving more. We're losing a lot of individual donors, and that's going to affect our future because people give more the longer they're in a church if they are growing in their discipleship. So whoever does this work better identify that the financial base that supports this big structure is shrinking. I would also observe that in Tampa, we tried to do this 8 years ago, and the incompatibilists blocked a new structure. They absolutely blocked that structure, and they did it on purpose. So the separation might actually help us, because if you're restructuring any organization and you're doing it out of fear, nobody's going to want to do it. That's true of corporations, that's true of nonprofits. To do really good structural work, you have to enter into a space of creativity and generative thought, not, I can find one more way to control the church through the money or through what I demand. You actually have to have people walk in the room and say, let's talk about what we all need and how can we best do that. But friends, we're in a structure of a denomination that was really built in the 1950s. Please name any corporation that's still running on its structure that was done in the 1950s. And I can't, if you can. Sorry? Yeah, Kodak. Kodak, great example. Yeah. You know, my brother was a vice president for General Electric at a site in Charlottesville, Virginia. GE was a premier corporation those days. Now they destroyed their structure through changing so rapidly, focusing all on their financial services. They got rid of a lot of their technology and a lot of their things, and they had a CEO who wrote a lot of books. But if you really follow the numbers, the outcome of all that was to take that stock right down. So change can be helpful or hurtful, but change is required. And you know, I've got some of my own thoughts about how it should change, but that's work that a broad, diverse group of people should do. So, and then we had here and then up there. Do we have anybody online? Okay, let's take another couple questions and let's go here. What's the process?
For that, and is that conceivable that would function and happen, or is it most likely that something like a simple split down the middle happens?
So the question is, let's take that regionalization legislation. How does that actually work? Like, how does it get passed? And then second, how will this split affect all that, essentially? So let me start answering and see if I answer your questions. Here's how it works. The legislation for that is properly before the General Conference. By that I mean, if you go on the General Conference website, you can look up regionalization plans, and you can read both a summary, but you can also read the exact legislation. If you are having a hard time sleeping, I would suggest that's when you do this, because it's a lot like legislation that is in front of the state of Colorado. Like, it's important that people deal in the details, but when you start reading the details, it's like, I've got to look up 10 paragraphs in the Book of Discipline, and there are these one-word changes. It's like that. But you can read the executive summary on the legislation, and it'll really help you get a feel for this. So all that's available. The protocol is properly before the General Conference. In order to have it properly before the General Conference, you need a certain number of delegates to submit it by a certain deadline. The regionalization plan is there, Christmas covenant's there, protocol's there, it's all there. Now, then what happens? Delegations are meeting. Our delegation in Virginia met last week. It was a 1-hour meeting. No, it was a 2-hour meeting, but we had 1 hour dedicated to the Christmas covenant. My worry is, I've been thinking we wouldn't have a general conference, probably until 2024, but I've got the responsibility of preparing a lot of delegates who have never been to general conference. So we've been meeting by Zoom. And I reached out to some of the people that created the Christmas covenant, and somebody came from the Philippines, and somebody came from Canada who's from Africa, and somebody came from another part of the world, and they came in and told us about their legislation. Delegations are doing that in different parts of the country, but not all of them. They asked us, at the end of it, they said, would you endorse this? Hey, Virginia, would you endorse this plan? I said to the delegation, I'm going to give you 1 month to reread this legislation, consider what we've heard tonight, and we're going to take that request, and we're going to vote on that. So we'll vote on that in a month. That's just a little vote that says Virginians like this. That's all that is. Not official, doesn't really matter, except what it may do is folks down in North Carolina may look at it and go, hey, Virginia likes it. Maybe we're a lot like them. Maybe we will too. So what they're trying to do is to lobby and to build momentum for certain legislation. Now, the incompatibilists have already said, we don't like this stuff. It would make sense to me that the incompatibilist would come to the General Conference if it was held in August, vote for the protocol, get the protocol through, and then walk out because they got everything they wanted, and why would they stay? That's not their future. In fact, when we originally did the protocol, we imagined, would it be possible for incompatibilist delegates to go down the hall and start planning their new denomination? Couldn't we celebrate that? And everybody's like, yeah, we could really celebrate. And could we then stop the General Conference and do nothing else? Or could we say we're going to have a limited General Conference? And the answer is no. The Book of Discipline does not allow you to do, the rules don't allow you to do that. And you don't have a way to change the rules until you get to General Conference. And sadly, not all, but some members of this coalition have said, we're going after all kinds of stuff. We're going to stay till the end of the meeting, and we're going to vote our conscience. And here's the other thing. Incompatibilists have been very successful having a leadership conference. It's often called the Africa Initiative. It's had different names at different times. And they bring in Central Conference delegates for a leadership retreat 1 week before General Conference. And when the leadership retreat is over, friends, the voting block is just so apparent in the way votes are taken as a delegate. Ken, am I being fair here? Yeah, so I'm saying something out loud that I think is fair to say. And my point of that is, wouldn't it be great if all of us could work in good faith with all of us? But I cannot predict that will happen. I'm not saying it won't. I'm just saying we did the protocol, and that was an example of a good faith effort. And frankly, it felt pretty good to do a good faith effort with people that I've respected, but who I know will be in a different church from me one day. I have a lot of friends in different churches. I have friends that are more conservative than me, friends that are more liberal than me, friends that are Lutherans, friends that are in independent churches. I've learned from everybody. So I have a pretty open mindset about that. I can't predict what they will do. So if it is passed, if it's passed the day after General Conference, it is law. Yeah, there's not a waiting period on this. It's just like legislation. Oh, wait, stop me. You asked about regionalization, so thank you for triggering my memory. The difficulty with regionalization legislation, and this is why it gets tricky here, it changes our Constitution. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I was about to look really dumb. It has to pass by a 2/3 majority of General Conference delegates at that meeting. And then, to your question, it goes back, the elements that are constitutional go back to every annual conference around the globe. And it has to pass that group by a 2/3 cumulative vote, which means Virginia may pass it by 100%, but another annual conference may have nobody in favor of it. And this is at your annual conference session. So to the woman in the back, your question about who votes for these delegates, this is not a delegation vote. This is your annual conference session voting. And when we add all the votes up from around the globe, we have to have 2/3 in favor of this legislation. And that is a very high, hard threshold. And if this group motivates its base to vote against that and stay, it can't happen. That's my prediction. But if this group says, we're leaving, we don't care, that has a possibility. I think it's broadly understood by people who want to stay that kind of needs to happen. So I've got a question here and then two over here. Are your all's questions related to what I just said? Or are they new? Yes? So the question is, at this general conference, if people would leave, well, they're not going to leave. That's what they've said. Oh, that's all done? Yeah, then that redesign can start. And the redesign of the church, this is back to your question, Doug, the redesign of the church can happen in one of two ways. At general conference, someone can make a motion and say, we need to redesign the denomination, let's create a commission to do that. And then that's just like the Commission on the Way Forward, they populated that. The bishops did. And it was a great group, frankly. It was an outstanding group of people. And I mean that for incompatibilists and compatibilists. And it was a great way to do it. The other way that you do it is you just get a group of delegates together and you write the legislation and you submit it and then you lobby and try to get enough people to vote for it and pass it. So those are two ways you can do it. Here. The question is about the demographics of delegates and their age in particular in the demographics and what that looks like over time. In the U.S., I think it is accurate to say that right now the delegates are younger than they've been in years. Years and years. And that's why many people want to hold this general conference, because they're like, look, we finally elected these people and they're younger people and we don't want to discourage them. We really want them to have a feeling that it's their church, not a feeling, we want them to have the experience that it's their church and they voted for that. So that's what I can observe to you. I don't know the demographics broadly. I think somebody has done that. I can tell you that the United Methodist Church in America, the average age of a United Methodist in the United States of America is 60. That should worry everybody in the room. LGBTQ inclusion is an important issue for us to resolve. It is not on my top 5 list of things that are really harming the United Methodist Church, the disagreement. What's really getting us is we're all getting older. And we're not being successful reaching millennials or Gen Z or anybody else. So let's go here and then there. Mm-hmm. So our question is about UMCOR, and will we lose UMCOR? Do we need to save UMCOR? So you may not be aware, UMCOR is an independent 501c3 related to the United Methodist Church. It is its own corporate entity. UMCOR receives a lot of money from United Methodist. Our jurisdiction, we're all actually, my experience is there are three things United Methodist agree on broadly. We believe in UMCOR, Westpath, which is clergy, health, and benefits, and Jesus. And hopefully not in that order, right? But I'll tell you, when you hear United Methodist talk, sometimes that is the order, except sometimes Westpath comes in the front. So, but my point is, people tend to love the work UMCOR does. And when we were doing the protocol work, the incompatibilists said we would still like ways to support UMCOR. And the fact that it's a 501c3 helps them. Now, UMCOR also receives grants from the the U.S. government to do work in like Katrina cleanup. They administered grants from the United States government as well because and they have to be a 501c3 and have their own corporate entity in order to receive those grants because the government can't give money to the United Methodist Church. So you see how clever we are. We just said, okay. So the board of directors would need to reflect whoever is supporting it. But I think UMCOR will be in good shape. UMCOR's problem is the same as the denominations. The base of donor support is aging every year. That's what's going to affect UMCOR. But I'll tell you, UMCOR is a big help to me as a pastor. Our people love UMCOR. We send a lot of money every time there's a disaster, and we know it's going to be well spent and well used. So let's go here. Oh, how the protocol and the Christmas covenant work together. So we have online?
Yes. Can you speak to the possibilities if the General Conference is not held?
The possibility of what?
What are the possibilities if the General Conference doesn't take place this year? Or maybe even...
So if the General Conference doesn't take place this year, what will happen? Will it go to... So you have two options. You go to 2023 and you hope it works out, or you say, we're going to have a quadrennium where we had no General Conference. And we're going to go to 2024. But I think if you do that, you have to re-elect all the delegates. I think. The truth is, I've not heard anybody clearly say, I've heard both things. I've heard, no, you can hold the same delegations, but we'll just do it in 2024. And I've also heard people say, no, if it's 2024, you're in a new thing. Now, here would be a really neat idea. What if we could meet in 2023 and thereafter meet every 4 years and move our General Conference off of election years? We hit election years in America every single time, and what ends up happening is delegates bring election issues into the General Conference, and it's just not healthy in any form or fashion. So I think that's a piece of that. So, great. Oh, go ahead. So the question is, will the Global Methodist Church leave if we don't have this General Conference? My understanding is there is one leader in this coalition said in a YouTube video, her comment was, no matter what happens, we're leaving. And I'll tell you this, your point earlier about the churches that are leaving, the base is leaving. The base is already doing the negotiation with their bishops, saying, you know what, we want to go, we're incompatibilist. And they've got, the 2019 General Conference created paragraph 2553, which gives them a 4-year time span to do it. And then the door closes unless that is there. So they have a way to do it right now, but there's another provision in the Book of Discipline that will allow them to do it anyway, and it's going to stay. So the point of that is, or it doesn't have a date that says it terminates after this date. The point of that is bishops are building mechanisms for how to do this. It's described in the Book of Discipline. And I think the base, listen, aren't we all sick of dealing with this? I mean, aren't we just all so tired of it? Like, there's no win here anymore. This is just a matter of needing to get something done. And so that's where I agree with my incompatibilist friends. I have some. And I agree with them that we need to do the work and get this done. I don't think it's just to do the work if a third of our delegates can't come. And there is a GBG, a General Board of Global Missions personnel, a man who wrote an article, and he predicts that a third of African delegates will not be able to get visas based on current wait times. And so if a third of our African delegates can't come, I don't think it meets the criteria that the commission has established for itself. Does that make sense, what I just said? Okay. Because remember, I told you, vaccination, visa, negative COVID test 24 hours before you get on the plane. And let me tell you, as somebody who flew to Sierra Leone, Africa, and back in October and November, nobody has messed around with that COVID test. You are not getting on that plane. You can have a ticket, you can have a sad story, doesn't matter. So those three elements are going to be present. So if a third of our delegates can't be there. So let me take one more question. Go ahead. So this is a great question. What happens if the General Conference is held in August and we pass nothing, right? Nobody gets the majority they need. The protocol fails, regionalization fails, everything fails. Then you've got the exact book of discipline you have right now. Yeah. Well, here's the deal. Oh, what's the likelihood? I can't predict that. Yeah, I just can't. I would love to, and I don't know any reasonable person who would try to predict that. Now, I do know the incompatibilists, when they count votes, they tend to be accurate. Right? They predict their wins ahead of time, and they win. I would go with their vote count. They think they'll win the votes. So I can tell you what they believe because they've said that out loud. So I'm not making anything up or giving you an inside scoop. That's out there. But I'll tell you this group of people wants to build a brand new house. And have you ever met a couple or a person who wants to build a brand new house? Aren't they excited? Aren't they super excited? And if you say to them, hey, you've got to wait another 2 years to build your brand new house, how do they tend to respond? People you know that build houses. They're like, no way, I'm getting out of that dump, right? And this is a group of people who loves their old home, but it dramatically needs a renovation. Like this thing was built in the 40s, and I love the way it looks from the outside, but the rooms are terrible inside. We'd like to open it up. We'd like to put down this new flooring. When you get somebody who's living in a house they don't enjoy, but they want to stay there, but they want to remodel, and you tell them, hey, you can remodel, but you can't do it for another 3 years, how do they respond? Happy or sad? Come on, people, happy or sad? Sad. So here's the deal. It's in everybody's interest to get on with a vote that succeeds, and there is no need for the people who want to build an old house to torch the old one. Does that make sense? And there's no need for the people who want to remodel to undermine the folks that want to build a new house. We just need to do the things God is asking us to do. That's my theory. But there is an issue if you can't get those delegates here. Is it just? And that has to drive a part of the conversation. Yes. Grab the mic so we can.
From the southeastern jurisdiction, I think, you might not be aware of the uneasy coalition between the centrists and the leftists, right? I mean, progressives.
I think that's fair.
And my initial reaction to what you're saying is if nothing happens, the church will shatter. I think if protocol passes, I think the progressives and the centrists can work together to form a denomination that is fully inclusive. There's going to be some debating on general conference structure. What do we do with COSRO? Religion or race? How do those look? I mean, we all have different sort of buy-ins at that. But I think the protocol can allow us to keep a larger denomination. I think if nothing happens, I think that the really progressive people are just tired of it and will be gone. And the centrists are going to try to hold the center, but the left's going to be gone. That's my gut feeling to what might happen if nothing happens. So.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think it's fair. And I think some of this is just anybody's best bet. I will say if it's not held and this group says we're leaving, something has happened. That is something that has happened. So that counts. And many of us have worked hard and lobbied our bishops to create fair and equitable ways for people to take their property and go. I don't know any United Methodists that I've spoken to, and I go to a lot of meetings, who's saying, we just want the money, we want the property. Everybody's like, no, take it, go, right? A lot of it's unfunded liability anyway. Like I mean, seriously, a lot of our churches are designed at a time period where they really need to be updated for people with disabilities. They really need to be modernized, and they're not, and just go. It's fine, So, but I think that the best part of that comes out of a heart of peace. It's helping people do what they want to do. So, okay, let me shift gears a little bit. Oh, there's one question in the back then. Yeah. So this is a great question, and I called on you because you warned me last night that you had this great question. And I noticed how you waited to the end for impact, which I really appreciate in you. And so the question is, hey, if this church splits up, how's it going to affect our mission? You know, we're in 50 to 60 countries around the globe. Some of our ministry is like 100 plus years old. You may not be aware, friends, if you've not traveled with the church, you may not be aware, we have schools, hospitals, universities, clinics, vocational training centers. We help the most vulnerable and marginalized people on the planet live. Like, we drill the wells in the villages that children go to with buckets and have fresh drinking water. I was in one in November. We drilled the well. We helped build the church. When I say we, I mean globally we. Sierra Leoneans, Americans working together. I was there because a hospital we support was doing a village outreach clinic, and there were 150 women and men, mostly women, lined up with little babies, all getting their checks, all getting their vaccinations, all carrying their vaccination cards. That's what we do on any given day of the week. And your question is, what's going to happen? Well, here's what I can tell you. In the central conferences, some of those central conferences may choose, if they're able, to join, or some of the annual conferences in Africa and the Philippines and maybe Europe may choose to go with the Global Methodist Church. They will no longer be on our portfolio of missions. They'll be over here. And these folks will have to support them. And so that's a financial obligation that they have signaled they are willing to undertake and want to undertake. That will mean that our mission budget will get smaller and possibly more sustainable. But if 99% of the money is coming from the United States and our population is shrinking and our donor base is shrinking, we have a sustainability issue that it is going to absolutely require focus. And related to missions, we're going to have to figure out, where do we have the highest impact? And here's an expression I want you to hold on to. Where do we do good well? So you can do good. I can do good by walking down the street throwing $10 bills out the window or out my backpack. But I'm probably not going to do good well. Does that make sense? So our mission budget requires focus. GB Jim's got to be very focused. And to the earlier question, if we want to get that level of focus related to sustainability, we've got to look at the entire general structure of the church and get focused. Because you can only manage a business for so long by selling off the inventory. We'll sell this building, we'll sell that building, we'll sell this parking lot, we sustain it. But what we've got to do is what my local church does every single year. Every single year, the local church I serve says we've got this much money coming in, and we've got this big of a budget, and the budget doesn't get to be bigger than the income. That's what we do, and we do as much mission work as any church I know. Hundreds, well, I don't need to talk about that. We send out a lot of money, and just recently we sent out a lot of money because we give our Christmas Eve offering away every year. So my point is, it's just the natural work that any functional nonprofit has to do. And we have to work together to do that work. You can't do it any other way. We can't do that if we're going to continue to fight with each other, mischaracterize one another, feel that if one person does one thing, it's probably because they got elected for this reason and you got elected for this reason and you're oppressive and I'm not. And we have got, Scripture says, come, let us reason together. That's what the United Methodist Church is going to have to do. But it's going to be hard work because we're in a complicated structure. But I think generally, to answer your question, this split is going to affect part of that. But the bigger piece of your question is the shrinking Methodist Church in America will produce a shrinking budget. And we will be around for a long time yet. It's not all going to fall apart tomorrow, folks. But we do have to pay attention. I think it's exciting work. When nonprofits do this work, they identify their virtues, their values, and what they're focused in on, and that's actually the life-giving work. So the sad thing to me is a lot of the work the United Methodist Church has been avoiding is the exact work that would have brought us together. It doesn't all have to be gloom and doom. So I want to stop the question and answer. Thank you. Wow, that was generous of you. You had a lot of questions, and so thank you. I want to show you a couple things that I hope will bring you a little bit of hope because they did me, and I'm going to try to go through these pretty fast, so next slide. At the Church of the Resurrection, where Adam Hamilton's lead pastor, large churches and young clergy gathered in October, and there were over 140 of the 400 largest United Methodist churches. The church I'm standing in right now was a part of that gathering. And they asked this question: how many of you are compatibilist? How many of you are okay if one of your fellow clergy persons doesn't do a same-gender marriage? And the answer is 94% of us are just fine with that. There are some 4% of the group said, we are progressive non-compatibilists, everybody should do a wedding or it's bad and we need to leave. And 2% are traditional non-compatibilist and they want to leave, and they just came to observe the meeting, and Adam said, yeah, you can come observe, we don't have any fear, go ahead, it's transparent. So I wish my local church looked like that bar graph on any issue. But here's what I want you to notice. Of the 140 largest churches who brought 3 people apiece. Yeah, it may have been 5. It may have been 5. I don't know. It was so 3 to 5 of us from each of these churches, and all these young clergy, young being defined as under 40. By the way, when you define young as under 40, you're officially in an older church. But here's what I want you to notice. Non-compatibilists say the more progressive compatibilists are going to come after you traditional people. There's no room for you in that church. That's why you've got to join us. What this bar graph says is, it's not true. That's just absolutely not true. Nobody's going after anybody. People are just happy to be in church together. Next slide. Then the question was, what do you think the majority of your church perspective is? And notice that the clergy and staff at a 96% level said their churches were the same way. So it's about the same. Next slide. Oh, by the way, go back one slide. Look on the far left. The progressive compatibilist said, oh, my church, probably only 1% of the churches there. Not 4, 1. Which means the clergy are more progressive than the churches they're serving in that little space, which is the smallest space, right? I mean, that's a few people. So next slide. Okay, here was the question. Don't worry, I've already dissected this for you in the next slide. You don't have to read those little print. What do you find most compelling about being a United Methodist? I want you to notice what the bars look like, because there's obviously a big one, number 1. Number 2 is pretty large. Number 3 is 211. Number 4 is 1. So you can see how this bore out compared to many other issues, because first Adam said, let's create the x-axis and the labels, and then let's vote on it. What do you find most compelling? Next slide, please. Here's the top 5. The people in that room said, here's why I'm a United Methodist. The emphasis on grace. God loves us and God forgives us, and there's prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace that gives us a life together with God's mercy. They said, we're passionate in Jesus Christ, and we want to serve others. We want to live out our faith by serving others. We have a theology that's inspired by Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. Perkins School of Theology, Albert Outler, that was a framework that he provided. There's been a lot of arguments over that, but most people think it's basically true. A wide welcome of people, meaning all people, a church of thinking people. This is one of the things that kept coming up over and over. We're thinking people. That's why we're compatibilist. We are smart enough to manage the fact that we sometimes disagree with our family members and our best friends, much less our church members. We can handle that. That's a compliment to us. This group of people makes that sound like that makes you stupid or you've sold out. And it's not true. Next slide, please. So, I think the United Methodist Church is founded on a Wesleyan theology of grace. And I think that's what this data reflects. It's anchored in Scripture. It's based on the life and teaching of Jesus Christ and the continuing movement of the Holy Spirit. I've given my entire vocational life to that sentence. I'm in. And I can't tell you, Ken, I don't know how you experienced, for those of you who went, sitting in this room was the most hopeful space I've sat in for 4 years. Denominational spaces. I walked out of that conference, I couldn't believe how I felt. Because I thought, I'm not alone. Like most people are like me. Now, it's only 140 of the largest churches, so that's not a perfect sample size. We all get that. But it was over 700 people. Next slide. First and foremost, we're dedicated to a mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world and the tradition of John Wesley. That's what our Book of Discipline says. You know something interesting? Their Book of Discipline sounds a lot like that. And yet you would think that we don't honor that at all. And that is a lie. And I'm somebody that's given my whole life to this, my adult life. Actually, my childhood too. I was raised in Methodist Church. They carried me in, and one day they'll carry me out. Go ahead. We embrace a church built in loving relationships rather than uniformity of thought and action. Now, there's where incompatibilists disagree. But this is where I live in my local church. We embrace a church where everyone doesn't have to agree, but where everyone is welcome. Friends, these folks are talking about whether I'm going to do a same-gender marriage. People aren't coming to me single. 2 same-gender women walk into my church with their 2 children that are their biological children. That's where we are. This group's acting like this is still a big debate, and we can tell people just don't be gay anymore, or we'll accept you, but what's behind that is we will help you not be that. I'm trying to figure out the answer to the question that these 2 women asked when they walked into our church 4 years ago and asked me, and they said, could we talk to you? Yes. And I went to their living room. We sat down in their home, and they said, here, we only have one question. What will you teach our children about us in Sunday school? I thought that was a fair and relevant question. And by the grace of God, I didn't blow the answer. I explained to them both where the United Methodist Church was, where I was personally, and where our church was, and in the end said, your children in our Sunday school would be taught that you are loved by a gracious and merciful God who loves them too. They will be taught that they should be good citizens of their family. And they will be taught, and I said, quite frankly, what we probably won't do is say, your marriage is valid or invalid, because we don't do that with any marriage in the church. We don't talk about anybody's marriage as valid in our church. We just assume they all are. You're here. That last sentence, I think, is sort of about that. Now, that's not just true of the LGBTQ people. When immigrants showed up in our church who were not legal, they didn't have documentation. I had some people that left our church over that. Well, you're just supporting them. You're just out here. We're giving away food and money, and how you doing that? That's not legal. Well, eventually, literally a couple of people, left our church over that. They were non-compatibilists about that issue. We're actually trying to help people become citizens, and we're trying to help them find jobs so they don't turn to crime, and we're trying to help their children succeed in school, and we've invested tens of thousands of dollars into that, because that's who we are as United Methodist. Next slide, please. This group was asked, what do you value the most about our structure, polity, and connectional system? Next slide. Top 5 answers. The emphasis on grace, the relational connection, the combination of personal and social holiness. Hey, by the way, you see that last one? The third one, I mean? That is a very traditional value in your United Methodist Church that I'm all in on. 100%. Personal and social holiness. I don't have all my personal holiness together, but I'm working on it. It's a lifetime deal. But social holiness, meaning the ability to change our society and help it reflect the reign of God, absolutely. Wesleyan heritage, and then a shared mission, ministry, and resources. That's your mission question in the back. The 2 women in the back, or 3, your UMCOR, and next one. Next slide, please. So I think what I learned from that group is we're really committed to making disciples of Jesus Christ, and we want to live a life of personal piety and social holiness. And we were talking about this after lunch. I have a really dear friend. He could be described as a traditional compatibilist. I told you about him earlier. And I can be described as more progressive on some issues like LGBTQ inclusion, marriage and ordination. And he said to me the other day, you know, Tom, and we've been talking about this and just blue in the face talking about it. And he said to me the other day when we met, he said, you know what, Tom, I've decided that people like you and me need each other. We create a tension that helps us both. Now, the truth is, he and I agree on about 95% of everything in the United Methodist Church. And in the 5%, we push each other hard because we've got a loving relationship that allows it. And he's done some things around social justice that he probably wouldn't have done because people like me have influenced him. And I've done some deeper dives into small group ministry and, goodness knows, contemplative prayer, which is just crazy, because of people like him, right? And so my point is, isn't that what we want in our church? Next slide. With more than 12 million members across the globe, we're a really powerful connection. We're committed to work for global health, education, creation care, meaning care of the earth, child welfare, disaster recovery. I've been involved in every one of those efforts. I bet you have too. I couldn't be any prouder of our church. I stood in 2002 in a women's vocational center in Sierra Leone, Africa, run by the United Methodist Women, where indigent women who live in endemic poverty learned tailoring and sewing and other vocational pursuits that allowed them to feed their children. So when people bust on the United Methodist Women, I just say, you know what, you might want to travel a little bit. You might want to get out and see what these women are doing, because that counts. And you know what? I don't like it when incompatibilists write their articles every single week. Because I'm on all their mailing lists because I've signed up. I want to know what they're thinking. And every single week, it's some nasty gram about the United Methodist Church. And I'm sorry, if that's your view of the United Methodist Church, you need to get out of your office a little bit more. You need to get off the dole of the group that's paying you to write nasty grams every single week. And how dare you insult that work around the globe? Because when people have disasters, we generally show up. As you all said earlier, people are still sifting the dust down in Boulder. Yeah. Next slide, please. And I want to be a church where when communion is celebrated, everyone's invited. I live in a part of the country where there was a time when communion was celebrated that if you had dark skin, if you were black, you were not invited. And I'm so glad that my forerunners in the United Methodist Church were so crazy progressive that they decided that was a bad idea. So that when I was a child coming up in the United Methodist Church, there were only a couple of African American families, but there were some people that made us a little bit diverse. And it was celebrated, held in joy, and it deeply formed me. It changed how I went to school, how I saw people. When we brought a refugee family from Vietnam and helped them get started in the United States, that deeply formed me. That changed who I was as a student, who I was as a young man, who I was as an adult. That's the church I want to be in. If other people want to be in a church where all we spend our time doing is talking about who's not welcome, that's fine. That's just, I don't want to raise my kids there. I don't want to raise my grandchildren there. I want to be in a different church. Next, please. I want to be a part of a diverse church, and I don't want to be in a part of a church where we all think alike, and we've all talked about that already. Next slide. This is a same slide. What would you change about the structure? Oh, no, this is about what would you change, not what do you like, but what would you change? And please see this response. Notice what they all said? Now, when they say the general conference structure, I think they meant the general church structure. LGBTQ inclusion, they would allow it. The apportionment formula, because can I just tell you something? Those of us who pay, the church I serve not only pays the largest amount of apportionments in our conference by a factor of 2 than the next size church. All the churches that don't pay their apportionments, the conference is trying to make up on that, they charge us more to do that. They do that here? It's a lovely formula, let me tell you. Many of us are really tired of carrying that weight. A simplified book of discipline. So here's the deal. Some of what our compatibilist folks, our non-compatibilist folks are saying, we agree with. It's not that they're wrong about everything. I mean, they're right about a lot of things. We want to renovate a house. You just want to build a new house. That's just 2 ways of doing the same work. Just let us renovate our house. Next slide. So I think we want to be a part of a church that affirms the wholeness of everyone. We are LGBTQ people. We are people of many abilities. We're people of many life situations. Next slide. We want to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And we are tired of partisan politics. And I got to tell you, this is my worry about what Kent said earlier. I think there are many of us who have been fighting the good fight and running the race with perseverance who may be so dispirited. If this group says we're staying, we can't wait to battle you out in 2024, my biggest fear is that there are a lot of good folks that are just going to say, I just can't do it. I'm done. Now, maybe we'll hand it off to a younger generation and it'll all go better than it's ever gone. I would love that. I'll celebrate that. My concern is there may be a lack of energy in the system because the first principle of thermodynamics, what's that called? Energy degrades over time. Second law, what's it called? Entropy, yes, entropy. Entropy sets into organizations. It's the second law of thermodynamics. Thank you. Come on. How often do you get to throw that out and somebody's like, yeah, that's the second law. Hey, pastor, it's the second law. Just don't lose your day job. That's what I'm telling you. Hey, that's really helpful. Seriously, thank you. That was really, really helpful. But it's the idea that energy over time either has to be reinvested or it is lost. My concern is we may be at a little bit of a place where that could happen. But I can't predict anything. And I think do I have anything else? I think that's it. Even if I have something else, I think that's it. Yeah. Hey, this was really fun. They asked people, how are you feeling about your church? Look at what most people said, hopeful. Most people said hopeful. And what are your church's offerings? Many people said, well, 23% said down 10% or more. Another 23% said down less than 10%. 25% about the same. And then other people said up. And it was just all across the board. Very shared experiences of everybody was in a little bit of a different place. And then I think that's it. Oh, worship attendance is down. Yeah, it really took a genius to figure that one out, right? I had to do a poll to figure that one out. But this is what these are the polls that Church of the Resurrection used. I thought they were really helpful. For me, I left feeling really good about our church. I said at General Conference 2019 that I'll never understand why I love the church. I just don't understand it. I've been a part of more failing efforts than any United Methodist I know. Like people walk up to me and they're like, Tom, thanks for all your work. And what I say is, if it ever succeeds, then you ought to thank me. I mean, it occurs to me I might be part of the problem right now, not part of the solution. And after all that, I go to church on Sunday still excited that somebody might accept Jesus. Somebody might renew their faith. Somebody's going to be so generous. We had a family in our church that heard that another family had a girl. She has a disability. She's in a wheelchair, and she had grown. She outgrew her old wheelchair, and the mother could no longer, she needed a motorized wheelchair, and her mother could not pick it up and put it in the trunk. And I went to this family, I said, this is a problem. And they said, we want to buy the van. They bought the family a van, and they said, make sure nobody knows about it. I got a guy in my church who called me in December. He said, I'm at Howard University. My work is in sickle cell anemia. I'm a leading research scientist on sickle cell anemia, and I see patients at Howard University, most of which are underserved individuals. And I have a research assistant who's probably not going to be able to get her PhD because she's got so many student loans that the bank won't give her any more money. And I said to him, I'm betting that she's African American. He said, absolutely she is. And I said, how much does she need? He said, $5,000. I went to a family in our church and I said, I got a weird ask. They said, we'd love to. And I said, you realize what you're doing? You're going to pay the money that's going to help a woman get her PhD, and she's already doing research on one of the most important problems that people of color face in our country. That's you. And I got to tell you, when people sit over here, and I'm trying not to use a bad word, but it's a word that means complain, and it rhymes with a person who emerges at Halloween. Are you with me? When they complain and moan about the Methodist Church, I'm quite frankly tired of hearing it, because I still love a church where God is still at work, and I hope you do too. Thank you. You've been so generous with your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. At 5:30 tonight will be a dinner served down the fellowship hall. 6:15 will be some pre-service music by Crossroads, our praise team. And 6:30 we'll have a worship service featuring Tom Berlin to preach. Thank you all for coming, and safe travels on your way home. And hope to see you either online or in person tonight. God bless you. Bye.